In terms of the HaRav, I had mentioned yesterday the famous question that there seems to be a contradiction if a person could be held accountable for an Aveira they're going to do. On one hand, we have the parish of the Rosh, Hashem Hashem, and the first Hashem is I have the Midas Rachamim, Kaidem Sheyechte Ha'adam, and the second Hashem is I have the Midah of Rachamim after a person sins and does Teshuva. And the Rosh asks the Kasha, why do you need Rachamim from Hashem before you sin? And the Rosh's answer is that even though, you remember from yesterday, that even though Hashem knows you're going to sin, He does not punish you ahead of time because He only punishes you when you do the actual sin. So I draw in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that Yishmael did not die in the desert because even though he was going to sin, or his descendants were going to persecute us. Asher Husham, Hashem judges you the way you are now, and that's what you're going to do in the future. Right, so that fits the Rosh very nicely. Asher Husham, Mamish fits the Rosh. The question is, Ben Sower Umora, where we see over there, Nidain al Shem Seifai, that he is judged based on what he will eventually do. So how do you reconcile the Ben Sower Umora, Nidain al Shem Sofo, with the rule of Asher Husham, that you're judged on the basis of what you are right now? So the Rishonim who ask this question, independent of the Rosh, they really give two answers. Answer number one was said yesterday, and that is, there's a chiluk between you sinning and your children sinning. Meaning, in the case of Yishmael, the pshat is, the taina of the malachim that Yishmael should not live is because his descendants are going to persecute us. So on that, Hashem says, I don't judge a person based on what his descendants will do. Masha'inkein, the Ben Sorer Umoreh, is being judged on the basis of what he himself will do. Now, that teretz is a good teretz for that particular contradiction. But it's obviously, the Rosh is obviously not going to agree with that, because the Rosh is saying that the second midah of Rachamim is, I am the God that will show you mercy before you sin. So it's not shaykh that the Rosh could go with that teretz, because the Rosh obviously learns Asher Husham does not only apply to sins of the descendants, but it even applies to the sins of the person himself. Now, the second answer that the Rishonim give is that Hashem will not judge you for what you will do unless you've already begun the evil now. So the Ben Sorer Umoreh has already begun the bad behavior that's going to lead to that Aveira. Yishmael, well, this is also a daichik, I think. Yishmael apparently did not begin. I mean, Yishmael was not a tzaddik. I mean, that's why he was sent out. But apparently the behavior that would involve persecuting and destroying Jewish people had not yet begun. So that could be, maybe the Rosh might be motive to that answer, meaning even though there's a midah of Rachamim, that God will not punish you for sins you did not yet commit, but maybe once you started the process, then you have a cheshbon, God might take you while you're innocent rather than wait till you're guilty. So one has to figure out exactly how the Rosh would interpret that statement. Now, the other point I was drawing a comparison to is that this idea that Hashem will not punish you for a sin you did not yet commit, which is the midah of Rachamim, Ani Hashem Kodem Sheyechte Ha'adam. So I compared it to the idea that Hashem does not punish you for a bad thought until you turn it into a maisa. So even when you have the machshava to do a chet, you don't get punished because of the machshava. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not mitzaref machshava lemaisa. So here, I just want to point out a very, very interesting Gemara that seems to say the opposite. And the Gemara deals with haforas nedorim. This is Parshas Matos, coming up in a few weeks. So what's the halacha? If a person makes a neder, a woman makes a neder, her husband has the right to annul the neder, to declare it mufar, provided he does it on the same day that he hears the neder. So if he hears the neder a minute before Shkia, he has to annul it in the next minute. That's a din of Yom Shamo. Now, the power of a husband to be mefer, a neder of his wife, does not apply to every neder. The neder has to be one of two types. It's either a neder of inoi nefesh, a neder that puts physical affliction on her, which could be anything. A neder not to eat chocolate is called inoi nefesh, something that deprives her of something, or a neder that pertains to their relationship, such as a neder that she's not going to ever see his father, or whatever it would be, right? So it has to fall under inoi nefesh or devarim shebeino lebeino. Now, the Torah says, if the husband is mefer the neder, Hashem yislach la, God will forgive her if she violates the neder. God forgives her because her husband annulled it. So the Gemara asks the obvious question: if the husband annulled the neder, there is no neder. If there is no neder, she doesn't need forgiveness. Why does she need forgiveness from God if she eats the chocolate after he was made for the neder? There's no neder. So the Gemara gives the following example. She made a neder that all chocolate is usher. The husband was made for the neder, but she was not aware of it. She ate chocolate thinking she had a neder. So the Torah says, even though she thought she was doing an Aveira, Hashem will forgive her for that, because Lamaisa she wasn't doing an Aveira. So what do you see from there? You see from there that if I think I'm eating something treif, but I'm so hungry that it's hard for me to control myself, I'm eating something treif, which in fact it's kosher, that is a sin for which you need kapara, you need atonement. So l'chaira, you could ask a question, well, wait a second. My only sin was in my thought. I thought I was eating treif. L'maisa, I wasn't eating treif. So if we say Hashem does not count a bad thought like a maisa, then why do I need kapara if I think I'm eating treif when it turns out to be kosher? See, bishlama the other way around. I eat treif, but I think it's kosher. There, I gave you two reasons why you need kapara. One is the poison idea that, okay, you didn't do anything wrong, but lamaisa, you have poison in your soul that has to be cleansed. And the other is the negligence idea. You thought it was kosher, but you could have checked it out. So we understand the idea, I think it's kosher and it winds up to be treif, why that's a sin. But why should it be a sin if I think it's treif, but it winds up to be kosher? If the only thing that's negative here is my thought, God does not count a negative thought like a negative action, right? So how do you reconcile that Gemara in Nazir with the idea of machshava ra, eina kadosh baruch hu mitzaref l'maisa? So here the Meforshim give a logical answer. They differentiate between a machshava that remains in the realm of thought and a machshava that was carried out in action, even though the action was not sinful. Meaning, if I'm simply sitting here on the table and thinking to myself, wow, I really want to have a ham sandwich, so machshava ra, kadosh baruch hu, it's not mitzaref l'maisa. But when I take my thoughts and I carry it out and do an action, even though, this is the chiddush of the Gemara, even though the action is not sinful, but the thought was carried out into Maisa, so then Hashem says, a thought that has been carried out into action, I'll punish you even for the thought. As the rule, machshava ra is not called a Maisa, is only when it remains machshava. But once it's carried out, la Maisa, even though you think it was kosher. I'm sorry, the other way around here. Even though you thought it was treif and it wound up to be kosher. But that type of machshava, you're going to be nanashan, or at least you need atonement in some way or the other. And that's the yesod of why the woman has to do tshuva, and she needs kapara from Hashem. Okay. So now, yeah.
I've always thought this. I thought it was a perfect time to ask. So, lota tura and not thinking bad thoughts in your mind, like not concentrating on bad things, where does that fall in?
Well, if you think about it, the pasuk says, do not follow the thoughts of your heart. So really, the prohibition about thoughts is because it will lead to to action. So really, it's the action that is the Aveira.
Thinking, or if I never do the action, is it still
So, theoretically, the thinking would be mutter if it doesn't lead to action, but the problem is the Torah is telling me that very often it will, and therefore you have to keep away from it. Like Shlomo HaMelech, right? The Torah says, don't have a lot of wives, lest you get distracted. He thought, I could have a lot of wives, it's not going to happen to me. But it did happen. So the person says, oh, I can think about things, they're not going to affect me. Unfortunately, they do. Okay. So now let's go back to the last thing, though, that we talked about, and that is the 13th midah of Rachamim. The last midah of Rachamim, right? Hashem is nosei, avon, fesha, v'chata'ah. God carries our intentional sins and our rebellious in spite sins, our inadvertent sins. Again, the order we still have to focus on, right? So that's 10, 11, 12. Vinake, and he will cleanse us. He will exonerate us. Right? So the 13th midah is Hashem will exonerate you, will clean you. Now, the Gemara asks, the Pasuk actually says, Vinake, lo yanake, which actually means, and to clean you, he will not clean you. So the Gemara asks the Kasha, which is it? Does he clean us? Or does he not clean us? And the answer is, he cleans you up. He cleanses you if you do tshuva. And if chas v'shalom you don't do tshuva, then unfortunately you will not be cleansed of your chait. And that's why lo yanakeh is not one of the 13 midos of Rachamim, because that's the other setting if you don't do tshuva. So v'nakeh, according to the Gemara, simply means he will clean you, he will cleanse you, he will purify you if you do tshuva. That's number 13. So the kasha is, l'chayra, that's already number 2. Hashem, Hashem. I'm going with Rabbeinu Tam for now. Hashem, Hashem. So the first Hashem is, I am the God that shows mercy to you before you sin. The second Hashem is, I am the God that shows mercy to you after you sin and you do tshuva. So the concept that Hashem accepts our tshuva is already in midah number 2. So what is midah number 13 adding to midah number 2? So the Maral, again, has a wonderful gewaldige teretz to be machalik between midah 2 and midah 13. And he learns, his general approach is, although you have to go through each one, the midos are in ascending order of mercy, meaning as you go through the list, you're reaching higher and higher and higher levels of mercy. There are 2 types of tshuva a person can do in life. Of course, you can cut tshuva in different ways. There's tshuva out of fear, tshuva out of love, but that's not the chiluk Maral is using over here. The chiluk Maral is using is what you might call global tshuva versus retail tshuva. Global tshuva is what a Baal Tshuva often goes through. In other words, that is, my whole life I was not keeping the Torah. I was not keeping kosher. I was not keeping Shabbos. I have decided to do tshuva, change my life with a commitment to the Torah. I've changed everything. That's complete tshuva. But what if a person, for example, has a number of averos? A person, let's say he tries to keep Shabbos, but he has to text. By the way, this is actually a problem. As trivial as it may sound, I'm not sure if texting is classified as an addiction. But in modern Orthodox communities, in New York and New Jersey in particular, there's a phenomenon that teenagers call, I keep half Shabbos. It's actually a term that's entered the lexicon. Keeping half Shabbos means I do everything correctly, except I have to text on Shabbos. That's my exception. So I don't keep Shabbos 100%. I violate the prohibition against texting. Okay? It's called half Shabbos. Alrighty. So let's assume a person does half Shabbos, but a person also speaks Lashon Hara, and a person occasionally steals a candy bar from a 7-Eleven. Stick it in. So they want to do tshuva on the Lashon Hara, but they can't do tshuva on the half Shabbos. So they want to do tshuva on one Aveira, but not necessarily on another Aveira. So the Maharal says like this. The second midah that says, Hashem shows you mercy if you sin and do tshuva, is only referring to a complete tshuva. I've done tshuva on all of my sins. I want to be better. But if I continue to sin in a certain way, but I only want to do tshuva on one thing and not another thing, the second midah is not going to cover you. Midah 13 is mechadesh, that Hashem accepts even partial tshuva. That is what Midah 13 is adding to Midah 2. Midah 2 gives you divine mercy if you totally change. Midah 13 gives you divine mercy even if you partially change. And that's why it's the highest of the Midos. Now, the notion of partial change could take different forms. There might be the partial change in which I do tshuva on Aveira 1 and I don't do tshuva on Aveira 2. But it's even more than that. Even within the single Aveira. Let's imagine you're a chain smoker of either tobacco or marijuana. It makes no difference for purposes of this example. And you have to smoke, well, you don't have to, but you feel you have to smoke even on Shabbos. But you've decided, I will not smoke except when I'm in the bathroom. Now there, you haven't even done a complete tshuva on this Aveira. But you're limiting yourself. You're saying, I'm not going to do it everywhere. I'll only do it in the bathroom. And of course, you're basically saying, I'm not going to spend the whole day in the bathroom. Now, in a sense, that's not a tshuva at all, really, because you're still smoking on Shabbos. But you're showing Hashem that you want to be better. You're showing Hashem that you're moving towards the right place. So the Maharal said, that is what is nichlal in the 13th midah. That even if your tshuva is defective and incomplete, and even if there are other sins for which you're not doing tshuva, and even if within this sin you have not done a complete tshuva, but you're showing Hashem that you want to be better, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is makabel your tshuva on that. Now, based on this, the Maharal has a gewaldige chiddush, a wonderful chiddush. What do Chazal say? V'nakeh, God will cleanse you if you do tshuva. Lo yenakeh, God will not cleanse you if you don't do tshuva. First of all, what's the chiddush of that? He will not cleanse you if you don't do tshuva. I mean, that's not teaching me anything. Listen to how the Maharal teaches it up. He's not talking about two different people. Menakel l'shavin doesn't mean, God will exonerate Ruvain who does tshuva, and God will not exonerate Shimon who doesn't do tshuva. If that's what it meant, there's no chiddush. Here is what it means. God will exonerate Ruvain who does tshuva, even though Ruvain didn't do tshuva on other sins. There's to read like an afal p. Menakel l'shavim. He will exonerate you and cleanse you from the sin of which you did tshuva, even though you will not be cleansed from the sins in which you didn't do tshuva. In other words, that is the concept, that Hashem will accept whatever tshuva you've done. Based on this, Maharal is machadesh, that the 13th midah is not just the word v'nakeh. The 13th midah is v'nakeh lo yenakeh, because that is making the very point. God will cleanse you of the sin for which you did tshuva, even though you will not be cleansed from the sin in which you didn't do tshuva. So the Maharal says, when you read the Yud Gimel Midas of Rachamim, you should read it, you should end it with v'nakeh lo yenakeh. You hear it? It's a real tremendous chiddush. Now I have to say two things. Maharal points out that number one, This brings lo yanakeh as part of the 13th midah. And number two, it also avoids the halachic difficulty of ending a pasuk before you finished it, because the pasuk ends lo yanakeh. And we have a general rule that when we daven in tefillah, we don't say parts of Pesukim. We try to say, of course there are many, actually there are a number of exceptions, I'll mention some of them. But as a general rule, we want to say a complete pasuk. So the Maral actually says that you say lo yanakeh, because menakel l'shavin ve'eno menakel l'sheino shavin is not talking about two different people. It's talking about the same guy who did tshuva on one thing and didn't do tshuva on the other thing. Hashem is makabel, half measure tshuva. And again, this is important. This is a very important idea for a person to know, because it's the old story, the old statement from Voltaire, that in life, too often, the best is the enemy of the better. You know what that means? The concept is, I have some idea that things have to be perfect. And if they're not going to be perfect, why bother to do something that's going to be defective, that's going to be incomplete? In other words, the idea of best stops me from being better. And that's a very, very big mistake in Ruchnius. If I can't learn 5 hours, that doesn't mean I can't learn a half an hour or 15 minutes. And to say, what's the use? It's only 15 minutes? No, 15 minutes is 15 minutes. I'm not advocating that you go that low. But if it came to that, learning 5 minutes is better than not learning 5 minutes. Right? Never take the position that if I can't do something in a completely good way, don't bother to be better than I am. The Chayvus Halavava says that there's nothing in Ruchnius that is so small that Hashem does not take notice of it. The smallest little thing counts for a tremendous amount. And that's besides the idea of mitzvah gereris mitzvah. Once you do a mitzvah, there's a momentum that gets built up. And that is the greatness of the 13th midah. If I'm not ready to stop smoking on Shabbos, chas v'shalom, at least I can say I'm not going to smoke, except in the bathroom or something like that. So people say, well, that's stupid. You're still smoking on Shabbos. It's not stupid. You're basically saying, I'm making some movement. I'm not going to be as poritz in this Aveira as I was. Right? I'm not going to speak Lashon Hara 15 minutes a day. That's meaningful. Rav Weinbach, Zichrono Livracha, our founding Rosh Hashiva, said it very well. He used to say, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. Interesting, right? Because what we heard from our imams was, anything worth doing is worth doing well, which of course is true. If you're doing it, try to do it well. But Rav Weinbach was making the opposite point, that even if you're going to do it poorly, better to do it than not to do it. Do it poorly. But doing it poorly means you're doing it, as opposed to the people who didn't bother doing it because they thought they couldn't do a good job, so why bother? The answer is, do it even if you're going to do a bad job, because at least you've done something. If it's worth doing, then it's worth doing even if you're going to do it poorly, he said. And that's very emes. And I think this is what the Maral is teaching us regarding the 13th midah, that even a partial tshuva counts in Hashem's eyes. Yeah.
So in this Devorah, just also check the Ashkenaz Nusach. We don't say the second part.
No, we don't paskin like the Maral. Again, the Maral's insight is very, very great, but la halacha, we do not say lo yanakeh. We actually don't say it.
The Nusach that we follow, whether it's Rishonim or whether they disagree with the Maral, or just because he's making his basis off the point that this is a part of the
well, first of all, they do disagree with the Maral in terms of his hezbollah of the Gemara. As the Gemara says, menakel l'shavim, eino menakel l'sheino shavim, they interpret that to mean two different people. And as a result, lo yanakeh is not a midah of rachamim. It's simply saying God is not going to forgive you if you don't do tshuva. So they say, well, that's not a midah of rachamim. The Maral's chiddush is talking about the same person. Now, how they deal with the halacha of not splitting Pesukim, that is an issue. But they say that since the end of the pasuk would be perennius, in other words, the lack of rachamim, if you don't do tshuva, so that would be a justification not to say that. But in terms of whether they argue with the Maharal's idea of partial tshuva, that you don't have a raya. Rabbeinu Yaina in Shari Tshuva very much follows Maharal's Mahalach. I mean, he was before the Maharal. On the other hand, Rambam might differ. If you remember the Rambam's description in Hilchos Tshuva, which we learned a while ago, the Rambam says, Tshuva Gemura is that you regret doing the sin and you resolve you will never do the sin again. And he even says that Hashem will testify that you will not do this sin again. Like the Rambam, it's very, I think the Rambam might say this: if I do tshuva on one sin and I didn't do tshuva on the other sin, I may still pass the test on that sin. But I'm not sure if in a single sin you can make the difference. Meaning, according to the Rambam, if I did tshuva that I'm not going to smoke in the bathroom, but I'm still going to smoke on Shabbos, I don't know if that would fit the Rambam's lashon of a tshuva gemura. So it may be that the Rambam himself would not agree with all of the implications of the Maharal. Although I'm not sure. Maybe the pshat is, if I'm not going to smoke in the bathroom ever again, so look how big that, or no, not smoke outside of the bathroom ever again. So it's not clear to me. Certainly the Rambam has a very, very chomor definition of what is tshuva. Like they tell the story about a chashuv person. He grew up to be a big Talmid Chacham. He just recounted he was a Talmid of Chevron all the way back in the 1940s. And the Rosh Yeshiva once saw him very depressed and said, "Why are you depressed?" He said, it was during Elul. He says, "I'm learning the Rambam that tshuva is that God testifies you'll never do this sin again." And I'm thinking to myself, none of us have tshuva really, because we do tshuva on Lashon Hara and we're going to speak Lashon Hara again. Like the Rambam, it's as if we have no tshuva at all. So Rabbi Cheskel Sarna, the Rosh Yeshiva, told him, interesting, why do you assume that we have to paskin like the Rambam? Rabbeinu Yonah says specifically that if you sincerely want to change, Hashem accepts your tshuva even if you're going to go back and sin, as long as you sincerely want to change. So instead of reinterpreting, many people try to interpret the Rambam in different ways. He just said, who says the halacha is like the Rambam? The Rabbeinu Yonah is also a Rishon. Rabbeinu Yonah says a different definition. Yeah.
If the pshat is that even if you give an incomplete tshuva, then Hashem's still going to forgive you, then how come if you bring an asham or a chatas, everything has to be exactly perfect, and if one little thing is wrong, then the korban is partial?
Well, because when it comes to actions have to be done the way they're prescribed. Meaning, when they say, okay, let me clarify this. When I said Hashem will accept even a partial tshuva, remember what that means. That doesn't mean Hashem will accept a partial tshuva as a total tshuva. Hashem will accept a partial tshuva on the little part you're doing tshuva for. In other words, on the other things, no. So, therefore, if your korban is off a little bit, you're not going to get an atonement on those things. Okay, in other words, we don't mean to say, Maharal is not saying, a partial tshuva gives me complete kapara. That's exactly the point. Menakeh l'shavin. On what you did tshuva, you get forgiveness. You don't get forgiveness on what you didn't do tshuva.
But doesn't the Gemara in Baruch say that the Olam Elah did tshuva for killing the city of Nov, and then Hashem forgave for all of his other averos?
I have to see the Gemara. I mean, l'chayra, that doesn't follow logically. In other words, you can't get kapara for the averos you didn't do tshuva for. You only get kapara for what you did tshuva for. But the Maharal's Machadesh that you'll get it for that avera, even though there are other averos you didn't do tshuva for. By the way, some want to be masber that this explains an interesting mishnah at the end of Maseches Yuma. This is actually a famous Mishnah because it's also a Simchas Torah song, in part. Rabbi Akiva says, Ashreichem Yisrael, right? Happy are you, Yisrael. Lifnei mi atem mitaharim. In front of whom do you purify yourself? Umi mitarer eschem. Then we'll talk about the repetition. And who is the one that purifies you? And the answer is Avichem Shebashamayim, your Father in heaven. How fortunate you are. B'Yomer, and another pasuk says in Yirmiyahu, Mikveh Yisrael Hashem. Now, their mikveh actually is the same word as tikva. God is the hope of Israel, but Rabbi Akiva darshans it mikveh, like water. Maha mikveh mitaris atzmeim. Just as a mikveh purifies those who are tamei, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a mikveh. He is mitayar you from your chait. Right? I hope this is familiar. Maybe for Simchas Torah, this is a song that is often sung on Simchas Torah. I will not give you a musical rendition today. Now, first of all, before I get to the connection to what I'm talking about, I want to go to the question. Note the question, the rhetorical question that Rabbi Akiva asked. Lifnei mi atem metaharim. In front of whom are you purified? Mi mitayer eschem. Who purifies you? And the answer is Avichem Shebashamayim. So the truth of the matter is the questions seem redundant. He's asking two questions, which are really one question. In front of whom are you purifying, and who will purify you? It's one question. Who is the one that purifies you? So the Chassam Sofer says an amazing thought. We know that there are 50 levels of impurity. And we know that the Jews in Mitzrayim were on the 49th level of impurity. Had they waited even the amount of time it takes for the dough to rise and become chametz, they would have been irredeemable. Hashem had to take them out. Because when you hit Shar Nun, you're a goner. Point of no return. And they were Shar 49. The 4/5 that died had hit Shar Nun. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Or Chaim say an interesting chiddush, which is very relevant to us, a very practical chiddush. The rule that once you hit level 50, you have no hope, is only before the Torah was given, as was the case in Mitzrayim. After Matan Torah, trying to connect yourself to the Torah will help you even when you're on the 50th level. Which means after Matan Torah, no matter how far you sink, there is always hope. See, we sometimes pride ourselves. We say, obviously we're not on the 50th level because we're still around. Well, no, don't give yourself that false confidence. We might be level 55. We may be really bad, but Baruch Hashem, we have the Torah, so we can be saved in ways that we otherwise couldn't be saved. Right? Which is a gewaldige point, that there is no point of no return once there's Torah. Let me just finish. So here's what the Chassam Sofer says. Lifnei mi, mem yud, is gematria 50. Lifnei mi, before you hit level 50, atem mitaharim, on your own you have the power to purify yourself. Umi, when you hit level 50, you can't do it on your own. Mitayer eschem, God will purify you through the Torah that He gave to you, right? So lifnei mi, before the 50th level, you have the koach on your own to purify. When you hit level 50, it's only the Torah. I'm sorry, someone had a hand up? Yeah.
The fact that we're no longer keeping the conditions that Israel did in order to keep themselves from going down to the 50th level would be a right that actually might be loved.
Is a riot to what?
Might be a right to value in fact, no.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Because if you look at it, 100% correct. The zechuyos that Am Yisrael had when they were on level 49, they didn't change their names, right? They didn't change their Jewish clothing. They didn't intermarry. They didn't speak Lashon Hara. How much of the Jewish people don't keep those things? Which means the zechuyos of the people on level 49, many don't have, including us on Lashon Hara and other things like that, right? So it could be we are 50. So Rabbi Akiva then turns to the metaphor of mikveh. God is a mikveh. Now in truth, although Rabbi Akiva doesn't bring it, there are two mishalim of purifying water that are used to describe teshuva. One is teshuva is like immersing in a mikveh. The other is God, this is from Yecheskel, so that's Yirmiyahu. Mikveh Yisrael Hashem is from Yirmiyahu. Yecheskel, and this is a pasuk that we say quite often in Slichos, V'zarakti aleichem mayim tahorim. I will sprinkle upon you purified waters that will make you pure. That is a reference to para aduma. You sprinkle water mixed with ashes. These are two purification rituals. Mikvah and haza'ah, the sprinkling of para aduma water. Both involve water as a purification ritual. Metaphorically speaking. Why are these two mishalim used? So I don't think the Maral says it, but based on the Maral, the mishalim are totally beautiful. What is the difference between purification via mikveh and purification via haza'ah? Purification of mikveh, there has to be total immersion mamish. If I go into the mikveh and there's a single hair that's above water, one hair, the whole immersion is puzzle. With hazah, it's exactly the opposite. I'm tameh and I'm being sprinkled with water. How much of the water has to hit me, and what percentage of my body does it cover even if it does hit me? Number one, only one drop has to hit me. So if a drop hits me here, the rest of my body is dry, the rest of my body is unaffected. Haza'ah still has a purification effect. So the remez here is, there are two types of tshuva. There is the tshuva of total immersion in which you fix everything. And that's like a mikveh. But haza'ah is a chiddush, that even if most of your life is not changed, but you made a change in one little area, Hashem will be makabel that tshuva as well. So the chiluk, the Maral says, is that mikveh is the second of the Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim. Haza'ah would be the 13th midah of Menakil L'Shavin, Eino Menakil L'Sheino Shavin. Okay, we'll stop here.